Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Conversations with Caregivers. My name is Shayna Purser. I'm a caregiver and program specialist at PsychArmor. We're going to be waiting a few more moments for others to join us for this conversation, but I would like to invite all of you to engage with us in the chat and in the Q&A. This series, sponsored by the USA Foundation, is an opportunity for all of us to learn with fellow military and veteran caregivers about difficult issues that affect our lives. During this conversation, we will learn together, discover new resources, and change the narrative of our own experiences. So please note that during these virtual sessions, they will be recorded and posted to our website, as well as on our YouTube channel. So if you were not able to join us live today, we will be making these sessions available to you later on. Today, we will be discussing caregiver employment. As caregivers, we often struggle to balance the needs of our loved ones and our careers. The balancing act can pose challenges to both military caregivers and their employers. Caregiver unemployment and underemployment are very complex issues. However, we are very lucky to be joined today by several fantastic experts that will guide us through these complexities to better understand both the challenges and the solutions to these issues. Today, we are joined by Conwell Smith, a caregiver, veteran spouse, and Chief External Affairs Officer for the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers. She has over 25 years of experience working in Washington, D.C. on policy and healthcare legislation. Prior to joining RCI, she was founder of Inside Pitch Government Affairs, LLC. She also served as Vice President of Legislation and Political Affairs for the Federation of American Hospitals, as well as Senior Health Policy Advisor for the Senate Budget Committee. Now, those were mouthfuls, but needless to say, she knows her stuff. Also joining us are Doctors Geri Lynn Maples and Jessica Strong from Blue Star Families. Jessica is an active duty Army spouse with 3 children. She is the co-director of applied research with Blue Star Families, where she works on research projects, which also include the recent report on caregiving in military families. Geri currently serves as the Dayton and Southwestern Ohio chapter director with Blue Star Families. She is a military spouse and caregiver to her husband, Robert, who served in the United States military and the Ohio National Guard for over 20 years. She is the 2020 Elizabeth Dole Fellow for Ohio and has several published works that focus on the needs of military caregivers. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. And to our guest panelists, can you first start us off by telling us, what is a caregiver?
I don't mind kicking things off. I'm Conwell Smith, as I've been introduced prior. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers, RCI, we're a not-for-profit organization founded nearly 35 years ago by former First Lady Rosalynn Carter, who is still very active with us. And we're dedicated to promoting the health, strength, and resilience of all caregivers at every stage of their journey. So this question of what is a caregiver for purposes of this discussion is very important. Our emphasis is on the unpaid family caregiver, and they're typically friends and relatives who are caring for the aging, ill, and or disabled. And that can take many forms, from financial assistance or help with household chores to daily wound care or administering medication or navigating care providers and insurance coverage. So I think this really kind of ebbs into the identity of the caregiver, but that might help our conversation to have some parameters about what we at RCI are thinking about when we're thinking about who is a caregiver.
I want to add a little bit on to what Conwell was saying. So to give some background, Blue Star Families runs our annual military family lifestyle survey every year, where we address a whole bunch of different issues that are related, that impact military families, caregiving being among them. And Blue Star Families and RCI work together in the 2020 military family lifestyle survey to look at to do a special report, special deep dive into caregivers in military families. And it's surprising that the initial questions that we run into are often the most complex. So when we first sat down to have these discussions around what is this report going to look like? What is this deep dive going to look like? We had to start with what is a caregiver? And that was much more complicated than it seems like on its face, right?
One would imagine, right?
Right. It's very it's much more complex than we think, because we got into issues around, well, we had been previously defining caregivers as people who raised their hand and said, I identify myself as a person who is providing unpaid care for someone who needs some sort of special care, whether that is a mental health need, a physical need, whatever that is. And that's one piece of the picture, but there's a whole gamut, whole range of other people who are doing the work of caregiving, but wouldn't consider themselves that because there are cultural ties to it, because there's a lot of weight attached to identifying yourself as this label of caregiver. So when we started out with this report that we'll talk a little bit more about later, we wanted to identify both self-identified and task-identified caregivers. So we asked a series of questions around, do you do these things for somebody who needs some special help? And one of the interesting things that we found with the survey and with the report that we did together with RCI is that a quarter of people that we would identify as caregivers said, I do all these tasks, but I'm not going to say that I'm a caregiver. I don't identify as such. So the way we defined who is a caregiver in this report was anybody who either said, yes, I am a caregiver, or somebody who said, I do these caregiving tasks. So it could be either task identified or self-identified, but it's very complex. It includes a lot of people who may not otherwise consider themselves part of this conversation.
That's so true. Self-identification, I mean, in so many ways, is a huge barrier to being able to not only, identify and support caregivers, but also for self-identification to get those supports, which, just increases those challenges. Geri, do you have any other insights that you'd like to add to what is a caregiver?
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say thanks again for having me here. Listening to Conwell and Jessica, I just want to add that I myself did not realize that I was a caregiver until I was approached with the information about the VA caregiver program. And then I started to really kind of understand, wow, I do all these things. I am a caregiver. But through my research, I kind of have a different description of what a caregiver is, because we want to raise awareness to those individuals out there who are doing these things and they're balancing their duties as a caregiver with their job, with their school, with their parenting. So when you think of what is a caregiver, it's a person of strength. It's a community leader. I often tell my fellow caregivers that you are a leader in your household, you're a leader in your community, and you have talents and strengths and all these qualities that make you an important part of the conversation in the community. So a caregiver is someone who really is just an awesome person, an awesome, just a pillar of strength to be able to do all of these things.
I couldn't agree more. And it's, and going along that vein of strength and these, incredible people who are able to provide this care while not necessarily being able to self-identify and get these supports. I think we identified in earlier conversations that caregiver is not just a singular role, that many caregivers, especially those who are still in the workforce, are also caring for more than one care recipient. And I feel like that has a lot to do with our conversation today, because that kind of does impede and or present challenges for our caregivers. Do you have any thoughts on that and how that might impact folks?
Shana, that was one of my favorite things that kind of came out of the Caregiving and Military Families report. Typically, when we were talking about a VA population or a military population, and even when it comes to the caregiver support program within the VA, we're talking about somebody caring for a wounded veteran or wounded military personnel. Mm-hmm. This really looked at the complexity of caregiving in the American family. The fact that you may have a sandwich generation individual taking care of aging parents and a spouse that is disabled and perhaps disabled children. And what does that complexity look like? And so, you know, it was interesting to bring to the table just the universality of caregiving in the family.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
as Ken was
Sorry, go
saying,
ahead.
it's all right. We're just trying to play up. We're
I
building
know.
up each other. This is how these conversations, when we were talking about this report too, is we go back and forth on like, well, what does that mean, and how do we add into that? One of the things that I liked about that as well, Conwell, is looking at like it really expanded the universe of who we are speaking of when we're speaking of caregivers. As I'll be honest, as I entered into that report and focusing on that, I initially thought of caregivers as, you know, caregiving for a wounded veteran or a wounded spouse or or even parents or grandparents who are aging, an aging population. But what we found is that a lot of the people who are doing the tasks of caregiving, a lot of the people that we identified as caregivers were caregiving. They might be caregiving for parents or grandparents as well, but they were often caregiving for children who had some kind of a special need, whether that special need was a learning disability or a physical disability or some other special need. There's this whole group of other people that I wasn't even considering when we walked into this. And I walked out of the report going, I think I might be a caregiver too. What? I didn't recognize this beforehand. But it expands that universe. And as you said, looking at the universality of all of these, of the impacts of caregiving on a family and on an individual.
Absolutely. And I just, once again, it really highlights, you know, some of these challenges that folks experience, you know, navigating being a caregiver, but also, you know, specifically to this conversation at hand, being in the workforce as a caregiver. And there are many challenges associated with this. Would you guys mind speaking on these kinds of challenges, both you've identified in your personal lives as well as with your research, and anything else in between?
I can go first to that. You know, being a caregiver to not just my husband, but one of those that fit in that category, caring for both of my children who are in their 20s, coping with an invisible illness as well, that is life altering. I too have to find that balance of care. Thankfully, I work for this amazing organization that allows me to do that. But before coming here, I lost a job because my son had fallen ill, and I had to take him back and forth to Cleveland Clinic 15 times in 1 year, on top of everything else that I had going on. So I can appreciate being with a company that, you know, allows me that balance and that flexibility. So I would say, you know, to employers out there, don't see those things as a barrier to employing a caregiver. See them as a, wow, you know what? Geri has the ability to balance all these things and still get her task done. And look how strong she is. Look how safe, look at her strengths and all of those attributes that come along with that. I think oftentimes I had mentioned when we were prepping for this call that I have caregivers come to me and say, should I identify as a caregiver? I'm applying for this job. And that's a real difficult question that our caregivers should not have to ask. So I'll lead that to Jessica and Conwell for thoughts. But I just wanted to throw that out there, that those are real issues that our caregivers are facing.
And if I may, just for a moment, oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Sure, Shanna. I was just going to say, Geri, unfortunately, you're just not alone. You know,
Yes.
you're not alone here. So a few years ago, one reason why I started my consultancy firm was because I saw glimpses that my father had dementia, and it was that regret I didn't want to have. And so I left my prior work to try to mold something that could enable me to be there for my family. And at RCI in the fall, we came out with Working While Caring. And my colleague, I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Karen Kavanaugh, who heads up our strategic initiatives. But she's really been the one that has been spearheading this effort along with our CEO, Dr. Jennifer Olson. But what we learned from this study was that 1 in 5 full-time workers are family caregivers who are providing care on a regular basis. Nearly 2 in 10 said they had to either quit their job, and more than 4 in 10 said that they had to go part-time because they were caring for their loved one. So we know, the information is there to give credence to what is happening in society because of caregiving. And it's very invisible. A lot of people worry about the stigma of it and really telling an employer that this is what's going on. But it's also it's always existed. But I think we would be remiss not to acknowledge the sign of the times as well. A year and a half ago, we did a study called Caregivers in Crisis, and it was really looking at caregivers during COVID. And we found out that 83% were seeing significant increases in their stress level. And so, as we look at the COVID, at the pandemic's impact on us, and then we see the mass resignation, and we see all of these women leaving the workforce. Now is the time to take this issue very seriously and figure out, how do we engage with employers? How do we make sure that when we look at our work in this realm, there are 2 priorities. First is staying attached to the labor market, because once you separate, there are other issues of financial insecurity, of no longer having access to your health benefits. But then secondly, what supports, even within the workplace, can we provide to those that are experiencing the caregiver role? We don't have the answers to all of these questions, but we're absolutely invested in asking the questions and starting this conversation.
Absolutely. I think it sounds like we have so far, just in this topic alone, a shared experience, because I too had to give up my employment and try to re-enter the workforce, due to my dual caregiving as both, a military caregiver and to a caregiver to a child with autism. And that affected not only, my a career progression at the time, and I had to leave the workforce, but also limited the opportunities available to me, because at that time there was not much flexibility in work opportunities. And then of course, navigating that, do I tell people, is this going to dissuade others from wanting to employ me, etc. And fortunately for us, we've been able to find needles in a haystack. But on the employer side, there's a lot of opportunity to be able to make this a more accessible, area of financial stability, but also self-identity, because we lose a lot of that. And of course, I don't want to forget about you, Jessica. Do you have anything else to add to this?
Yeah, I was going to touch on, Conwell started the conversation about how COVID has impacted caregivers and how it's it's shifted like the employment landscape for everyone, but I think it's particularly impacted caregivers, and especially those who, need a little bit more flexibility with employment so that they can go and take kids to doctor's appointments or go to doctor's appointments for their care recipient. And I wanted to add a little bit of research piece to this. We, Blue Star Families, did a separate study, a separate survey called the Resilience Under Stress Study. We thought it was going to be towards the end of COVID. It was not towards the end of COVID. It was in May and June of 2020. So I was very optimistic that COVID was not going to be still impacting us in 2022, and that might have been a little bit off. But one of the things that we looked at COVID's impacts on a variety of bunch of different populations, a bunch of different demographics. And when we looked at caregivers, it was striking that caregivers sort of had greater impacts in almost every single area that we looked at. They had greater impacts to their employment, their mental health, their kids' mental health, their financial situation. All of those things had greater, major, severe impacts and consequences. But they also had fewer supports within the community. They had fewer social resources. They had less significantly less perceived social support. They felt less belonging. So this is a group of people who are very strong, as Geri points out, that go and get stuff done, but also has the ability to be supported more, in both through the community and through employers, as you and Conwell are talking about, that there's an opportunity for employers to, well, caregivers to ask for more supports and employers to offer more supports to people who need some more flexibility and more support in the workforce.
Can
That's
I
a great
add to that?
opportunity.
I'm sorry. Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
So building off that COVID point that Jessica made, one thing that COVID has taught us is that there is opportunities to take things out of the office and put into the home. And so if there's any employers out there who are listening, not only does that benefit the caregiver that you're supporting, but it also benefits you too, because I'm sure it cuts down on costs. I did my own research a few years ago during my PhD program that said up to $11,000 in for just one employee that can save you. So I don't know if that dollar amount is still true, but that's a pretty significant amount of funding that you can save just by hiring a caregiver and allowing that flexibility. I talk to caregivers all the time, and they talk about, the ability and how grateful they are to be able to work from home and have that flexibility. Not only does it provide financial stability in many cases, but it also is that level of self-care. My work is my self-care. It's my time. It's my time for me. And so we don't want to take that away from our caregivers. We definitely want to give them those opportunities. So for those employers out there, I just strongly want to emphasize that benefit to you.
And I have a quick question from one of our audience, our registrants, folks in the audience. One person, Karen, she asks, does the American Disability Act help cover the needs of caregivers? Do you think that holds a place in the needs of caregivers, or is that solely for those who are possibly care recipients?
I think we can do better in any legislation to make sure that we're not only looking at the care recipient, but we're looking at the caregiver. And this is a real core to the mission at RCI. It's to actually look at the caregiver and their health and well-being. So
Yes.
we would love to envision a world where any legislation that is dealing with any illness or what have you is considering that caregiver in their own right and their own health. For example, using caregiving as a social determinant of health, making sure that you're screening and asking somebody, are you a caregiver? And studying those things about what are the risks that exist because you are a caregiver, because we know there are some. We know that we put our own health aside while we're taking care of another. So I think this raises, I don't know the specifics of ADA with regard to caregiving, but it raises this issue of always making sure that caregiving is central to the conversation. And it also,
Absolutely.
a little while ago, our leader, Rosalynn Carter, did an op-ed really kind of talking about how we need better coordination. We don't have an office of caregiver health and well-being. Well, maybe we should. Maybe we should make it so that all legislation and all policies are considering this in a very formal way. The VA has done such an incredible job of getting caregiving out of the shadows and actually making it a priority within the agency to see them and reach out to them. Now, granted, it's more of caregivers of the veteran or of the military spouse, but still, I think that they have really moved this along at rapid pace, and I think it's time to double down.
Absolutely. And I think that's something we keep touching on, is that there's more work to be done, and there are more opportunities for us to really circle as a community around caregivers in addition to their care recipients, that there is some inherent worth and quality of life standards that we need to uphold for our caregivers. And we kind of touched on, what are some of the key challenges that caregivers are faced when trying to balance those, work responsibilities as well as care responsibilities. I'd like to ask you guys, in addition to what other, challenges and barriers there may be or struggles that caregivers may run into, but also, can you recommend any resources or strategies that both caregivers and or employers can employ to address some of these barriers and challenges?
Well, with regard to additional challenges, what we learned in working while caring, which was a survey of caregivers, was that younger adults and people of color and paid hourly workers reported more frequently that at some point while they were caring for their loved ones, they had to quit, reduce their hours, or stay in their job longer. We know that people are also foregoing promotions and those types of things. So again, sign of the times. We not only have the pandemic that we're all living with the parameters and stress, but we're also in an age of enlightenment, I like to say, when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So it's a real opportunity to definitely see how supports, how employment, all of those things affects us differently by way of our cultural differences, our age differences. And if we're not doing that, I don't think we're going to get a full picture. And so I think, we're really starting to have more of those conversations than we did 10 years prior. And we're starting to think through, when you're trying to come up with a solution, one size doesn't fit all. And we need to really consider that. That kind of gets at Jessica's comment about the fact that people didn't even identify as caregiver. Well, a lot of times that's because of age or race or some other predisposition to how you view yourself taking care of a family member. Some people might think I'm just being a daughter, or, this is just what we do. And so we don't think that way. So I think a big challenge is drilling down to get more information. More information is only going to help us make life a bit easier for this population, which is 53 million strong, by the way.
Anyone else have to add to that?
Yeah, she did an excellent job.
Yeah.
I don't know how much more I have to
I know,
add,
really.
but I think really just to give you an example, last week my husband had surgery, and when I went into the hospital, I had my briefcase, my laptop, my phone, my clipboard, and I sat there and worked while he was getting surgery. And I think when you think about just how flexible you have to be, again, I'm just grateful that I'm able to do that. So I just want caregivers to know that just be creative in how you go along this journey. No one caregiver's journey is the same. Everybody has different unique experiences. But I just want to say, that we are blessed with online communities and things like that. I can't tell you how many times I saw this advertisement and was tagged on LinkedIn and Facebook and things like that. And so we are blessed to have a community where we do support each other. And I think that's a good quality to really kind of grab a hold of and say, you know what, wow, they are, no matter where they are geographically, we know each other, we take care of each other. And maybe it's just a way of communicating that out into our local communities to raise more awareness of, what we do have caregivers who are our neighbors, they're our friends, they sit next to us in church, and they work next to us in our employment. So it's just really just raising awareness and all of those things that Conwell said.
So I have a quick question on the raising of awareness, just because, on the topic of barriers and challenges, but also, rewriting that narrative, not only for ourselves and our worth and what we do have to offer the workforce, but how can we address the social perceptions of caregivers within the workforce and within the workplace? And how can we really sell ourselves in a positive way that might combat any negative preconceptions about caregiving? I know that was a tough one. Sorry, y'all.
I mean, I don't know. I think Geri's already covered it. She's already talked about how, if you're a caregiver, if you identify as a caregiver and that is what you do, you are already skilled in getting stuff done that needs to be done. I mean, oftentimes, regardless of whether your care recipient wants that particular thing to be done, it has to be done. So you're going to get stuff done. So
You have
Geri's
skill sets.
Yes, skill sets and dedication. So Geri's there with her laptop typing away at emails while her husband's in surgery. That is
Write that on the resume.
multitasking, can balance multiple priorities at the same time. But that's a really clear example of one of the strengths that caregiving brings, or that being a caregiver brings, and you can bring to your workforce. I don't have evidence to this. I don't have data. I'm the research person.
That's the research in you.
But I know I always want to have something to back it up. But I suspect that people who are like caregivers, who have that flexibility in their employment and who have the ability to balance those things in a way that works for them and their family, are probably going to be more, probably going to want to stick it out at that employer a little bit longer than somebody who does not have that flexibility. So they're going to give back 110% of what they get, or more.
Yes. And there are case studies. I will go ahead and support you. There are case studies that support what you just said. So boom.
Thank you.
Research.
I haven't done a literature review on it, so I'm speculating at this point, but I'm glad to hear that you have.
Luckily, I can be completely anecdotal because I'm the non-doctor in the room. So, I'm going to speak to experiential data, if you will.
Let's do it.
One of my favorite things that's been said all day, and I think for anyone paying attention today, really came from Geri. And it was, here Jessica and I are defining the caregiver. What's the clinical definition, or what's the research definition for our purposes? And Geri just came out the gates and said, a caregiver is a leader. A caregiver is an empath. A caregiver is a multitasker. We have to build each other up. The facts are clear. Caregiving is hard. As a group, they have poorer health outcomes, higher levels of stress, less financial security than their peers. But we have to take back that pride of I'm a caregiver. The first way to eliminate a stigma is to own your space. And we're seeing this wonderful trend lately in LinkedIn, where when people take time off from work for whatever purposes, they're saying caregiver. They're putting it in like the job that it is.
And LinkedIn has supported that. LinkedIn has now added a facet to their platform.
And with this, I want to give a real shout out to PsychArmor. I apologize it took me this long to do this, but a big part of owning the space is self-care. Your confidence is going to lag when you're exhausted. Your confidence is going to lag when you feel invisible. So you have to take that time for yourself. You have to take that time. I would say the number one key to caregiving in any space is self-care. We have to pause and take care of ourselves. And when we do that, we build our own confidence and we present differently. And so, when it comes to this grand reentry that's going to occur in the work market, we really need to feel a sense of pride, get a little rest, take care of ourselves, take advantage of the many courses and whatnot at PsychArmor and elsewhere, and of caregiving coaching, which can just be incredibly helpful. And that is, Jessica, proven in data. So we need to do those things and fill our own soul. And I think that we'll then radiate to others.
That resonates. Wow.
I want to add on to what you're saying there, Conwell, that it is easy to lose. I feel like it is easy to lose confidence in yourself as a caregiver because often the tasks that you're doing are they're ambiguous, they're regular, they're not recognized, you're not rewarded for those things like you would be in an employment. When you finish a job and do a good job, your employer says good job and here's your raise, here's your promotion, good job on you. That doesn't happen when you're caregiving. You don't get thanked for taking people to doctor's appointments or for doing all of those day-to-day tasks that come with even the emotionally draining, the very difficult daily tasks that you have to do. You don't get thanked for that. You don't get recognized for that. So it's easy to devalue yourself because you're not receiving that positive evaluation of your abilities. So I'm right there with you, Conwell. We have to remember that even if we're not hearing that feedback that we're doing a good job and we're doing really good work, it is still there, and we can't lose confidence in ourselves because of that.
I would like to follow that up, number one, with a shameless plug that PsychArmor does have. We collaborate with EDF to have a Caregiver Recognition Award and badge that one day we hope to be able to use to allow folks to have their caregiving recognized in LinkedIn in these professional capacity as well. Because like you said, this identity, this strength, I mean, we become problem solvers of the upteenth degree because like you said, there's no manual for this. We have to figure it out on our own, even without that positive reinforcement and applause. And so I couldn't agree more. And so, I mean, kind of wrapping up on that, what resources are available to help caregivers, you know, not only just recognize themselves, maybe even self-identify, but also what research can they read if they are so inclined? What supports can they find that can help them in their returnship to the workforce, or anything else in between that, you know, your collective, you know, minds might recommend to a caregiver who may find themselves looking at going for employment?
I will.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, some of you are hopefully familiar with our military programs at RCI, Operation Family Caregiver and Operation Caregiver Support. Operation Family Caregiver is a one-on-one coaching program for military caregivers, and Operation Caregiver Support uses the same strategies, but applies it through virtual support groups. And some of those support groups are fun because we're really experimenting with sameness. So like have a support group that's all parents, or having, you know, doing things that are a little more broken down and giving people the comfort of the space. So I really want to encourage people to go to our website and take a look at our programs. And I know that we're speaking probably primarily to a military audience, but again, caregiving takes many forms in a family. So we also have dealing with dementia, which is a wonderful support to those that have dementia in the family. My father has Alzheimer's, so that's more my experience. And we're constantly looking at new and fresh and always evidence-based programs to help caregivers. So I encourage you to go check that out. And RCI also does Caregiver of the Year awards. And I think that it's really important we as a community start doing more of that to acknowledge those that have been working so hard on behalf of their family.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to give a plug to Blue Star Families. And I want to give a shout out. I don't know if Vicky's watching, but Vicky does our caregiving program here at Blue Star Families, and she's amazing. Everything that she does is just so valuable for our caregivers. So I encourage everyone to, if you're a caregiver out there, to go and look at what she's doing on our webpage. I believe she might have some cohorts coming up that really do shine on that community caregiving community, and allows them to work together and just come together and share stories and connect. That is just so invaluable to have that extra support from someone who understands what you're going through. And then Laura, with our career program, just so amazing. She has some really amazing partners and just works so hard on behalf of our spouses and others who take advantage of what she has to offer. So those two plugs. And then I'm going to talk from personal experience. And 2009, I decided to go back to school. I was going to be a social worker. As you can see, I didn't follow that path. But I came across an organization, Thanks USA, and they are my family. I've been involved with them ever since I got my first scholarship. And because of them, I was able to study all the things that were impacting my family, from post-traumatic stress disorder to traumatic brain injury. I even did my senior capstone on traumatic brain injury and brought in folks to help understand how that was impacting my life. So I have to give a shout out to them, because I feel that if you're going to re-enter the workforce, or even if you just want to invest in yourself and study those things that are impacting your family, education is the path to do that. So thanks to Thanks USA and Blue Star Families, I'm just blessed. And sharing that with all those caregivers out there, they can come join our families too.
Yeah, and I would like to also follow up with that experiential piece, because I was not always in the best of places. And when I found myself wanting to re-enter the workforce, I too found myself in a position where I wanted to return to school. And that was a very intimidating experience, having been out for a while and then not sure whether or not my caregiving duties would impede that process. I did go for a degree in social work, but I also made sure, I know I'm a little bit biased, y'all. Sorry, not sorry. But I did concentrate also on military social work and military families. And it was that same passion and interest that brought me into this field, but also just drove me to want to go bigger and better. And it was thanks to several organizations, scholarships, like we spoke about. Hope for the Warriors has several caregiving scholarships. There's also the National Military Family Association that has spouse scholarships. Hiring Our Heroes, they have several, I think fellowships is it, but they also have one specifically for caregivers. Now it's not available nationwide, but there are areas in which caregivers specifically can be introduced to the workforce in a paid fellowship. So there are resources out there. And I think you and I are great examples of how those can support your reentry and help facilitate that. So I just really want to appreciate and say thank you for mentioning that, because that experiential piece right there, we did that and it helped.
You both just kind of brought something up that that I really haven't shared with many people, but I want to share it because I think it's important for an audience of caregivers. 2 years ago, I was taking care of a best friend who was dying of kidney cancer, and I had gone back to school, and I dropped out because of the pressures of taking care of him. And I want to share that because sometimes it's a bit too much, and sometimes you have to take back your space in whatever way you know how, and that's okay. There's going to be another day. And so I just want to, I probably felt the stigma of dropping out of my master's degree for a while, and I want to let it go in order for others to let it go, because it's hard caregiving. It really is. And we need to do more for all caregivers, but especially our military families. If there's one thing Jessica and I learned, it's that military caregivers, as a quote, as they've historically been described, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more caregiving taking place in these families that are dealing with moves and deployments and all of these other things. And so the last year and a half that I've been with RCI, I am so moved by our community. I mentioned Operation Family Caregiver and Operation Caregiver Support, but what I didn't tell you is that Elizabeth Dole Foundation has helped us with Operation Family Caregiver in that we refer to their respite program, you know, and Wounded Warrior Project has been funding this great support structure in Operation Caregiver support of bringing different groups together. And so this is a community that raises the collective. And we should be very proud of that. There are other issues where people are a little more territorial, or, you know, they want to get their space. I have not experienced that in all of these organizations. The partnerships have they just give back every time. And so I want to share that with the community, because there are a lot of resources out there, and there's none of us on the screen cares where you find your resource. If it works for you, then you take care of you, and we support that generally.
Absolutely. It takes a village. It really does. Thank you, Conwell. It's so entirely true. And it really does take an entire community to come together to solve these complex problems. We can't do it alone. And I really want to extend my thanks to you, especially, you know, on behalf of PsychArmor, on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of those who've joined us today, because I don't know if you've seen, but this chat has just been going and going. And so many people, their words have resonated with so many. And I think that this is just the beginning of the conversation. The conversation continues, so to speak. And I'd really like to take a moment to thank you. Before I start, you know, working through my closing remarks, is there anything else that you guys would like to add to the conversation that we may not have touched on yet today? No pressure.
I just want to add that for those caregivers out there who may be watching now or watch later, definitely join our communities on Facebook, where you can be connected. And you don't have to enter the conversation. For example, on our Elizabeth Dole Foundation, the Hidden Heroes community page, oftentimes I don't say anything. I just read. You know, before I wake up in the morning, I have my phone and I'm just scrolling through Facebook, and I'll read chat and things like that. And I learn so much valuable information that way. So if you don't feel comfortable talking or joining in the conversation, just reading what others have to say is so powerful. So I definitely encourage you to do that. You know, just other resources out there. Feel free to connect with me if you have questions or anything like that. I'm here to help.
Kind of wanted to say something that was in the same vein, Geri. It was about, you know, and it's okay to be a lurker. You can join Facebook groups and not say a thing, but learn a lot of things in the background. That's okay.
Resources,
it's also,
all of it.
Yeah, it's also okay if you don't feel comfortable with that title of caregiver and you're doing some of the work, but you're like, I don't consider myself a caregiver because there's other people who have a more challenging sort of care recipient or a more challenging circumstance than I do. Or I'm just being a parent, or I'm just being a daughter. This is just what I do, as Conwell said earlier. If you don't want to call yourself a caregiver or identify as such, that's okay. But it is still helpful to find people who are going through similar circumstances that you are. Caregivers, that may be a caregiver group, that may be a group for parents of children with special needs, parents of children with autism, a group for adult children who are caring for their parent or grandparent. Even if it's not a caregiver group, finding other people who remind you that you are not alone in what you're dealing with can be very helpful. Even if you've never engaged, even if you just sit and watch in the background, it's useful to know that you are not alone.
Absolutely.
At the Rosalynn Carter Institute, we like to say we need to meet caregivers where they are. And some may be more apt for a one-on-one, some a group setting, some anonymous. And so RCI's partnered with Crisis Text Line with a keyword TOUGH, T-O-U-G-H, and I'll make sure that this information is available as well. In case you're just feeling overwhelmed and you just want to text with someone who can help. So there are all kinds of ways to interact and to release that pressure valve There are a lot of organizations out there that are ready to meet you where you are.
That's powerful. And before we start to close out, I really appreciate these last remarks, because all of them just resonate and ring so true, you know, and I can say this just from my personal experience. And, you know, that isolation that can occur, but also we can be our own worst enemy in our mind. We may, you know, internalize this. We may not know about the resources or opportunities, or really know that some things are just a thing, that this is something that so many others are experiencing. And I just would really like to reiterate that this connection is huge, and that, like y'all said, it's okay if you're a wallflower, because you can still benefit from this important information, this important connection. And for those, I've seen so many folks in our chat asking, you know, about these resources and recommendations for these communities. And I don't want to do a disservice right now by listing some, but not giving you the full grasp of what all is out there. So I would like to let everyone know that following today's session, we will be sending out an email, you know, with some of the key topics that we've addressed today, some of the resources we've discussed, not only with our guests, but also those that have been shared in the chat, because we do not want to let those, you know, go to the aside. So we will be following up with more information and resources so that you can have something to take home with you today. So with all of that said, I'm going to go into my ending spiel. I really want to thank everybody for joining us for this conversation. To Conwell, Jessica, and Geri, thank you so much for providing your expertise and sharing your experiences with us today. I couldn't have been happier with the conversation and just how many important pieces we touched on. Also to our attendees, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. Caregivers specifically, if you are joining us today, please know that you are not alone in this journey. Many of us have shared these experiences, and there are resources that can support us. So please keep an eye on that inbox. We will be following up with those resources and tips discussed during today's session. You'll also receive a brief survey in the follow-up email, and we would just really greatly appreciate it if you took a few moments of your time to provide us with your feedback. All of this helps in continuously improving upon our sessions and programs with conversations with caregivers. And if you are an employer or professional joining us for this conversation, I would like to let you know that PsychArmor does have an entire library of resources to support you in supporting military affiliated communities. And so you can access these courses for free through our newly launched website at psycharmor.org. And then of course, if anybody has any questions about today's conversation, please feel free to email us at support@psycharmor.org. So that's it for today. We really appreciate you joining us today, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next Conversations with Caregivers. Goodbye, everyone, and thanks again.